Support for WMFE comes from JustCallMo.com and attorney Mo DeWitt. As a Central Florida native, Mo DeWitt is committed to offering legal guidance in personal injury cases such as car accidents and slip and falls. Offices in Orlando. More at JustCallMo.com. Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Engage is made possible with the support of inaugural sponsor, JustCallMo.com, and the support of listeners like you.
You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, we'll talk with an Orlando couple coping with a devastating Alzheimer's diagnosis, and we'll find out why cases occur twice as much in Black and Latino communities. First, though, reporter Amanda Rabines joins us to unpack her investigation into the failure of OnePULSE. The OnePULSE Foundation was formed by the owner of the Pulse nightclub to honor the 49 people who were killed there on June 12, 2016. The organization dissolved at the end of last year without ever creating a permanent memorial for the victims of the shooting. An investigative piece filed with the Orlando Sentinel tells us the untold story of the foundation. Reporter Amanda Rabines joined Engage to share her findings about the failures.
This was an organization born in the aftermath of the Pulse tragedy, and it was put together by a very big group of well-meaning people who collectively just took on more than they can handle at the end of the day.
Talk about some of the missteps that you uncovered, please.
I mean, this could have been a story on its own, just, they took on more than they could chew, but they were facing project scope challenges, fundraising challenges, internal conflicts much earlier than was publicly let on. And that's what, my reporting really discovered in this. And at the same time, they were dealing with a significant governance problem. There was a board oversight that did not put in the proper vetting for this project of theirs, which was the museum, which really became an overwhelming fundraising project that they were not ready for.
How did this get so turned so sideways? Who was overseeing this?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people just failed to take ownership in this project because you have, a board that serves to oversight the executive committee. You have an executive committee dealing with volunteers and staff members. And all of these people, could have really asked the question, can we do this? And unfortunately, when everyone's also really passionate toward a really significant tragedy, there's those aspirational goals that they want to see through. But I think there were not enough checks and balances when going forward with this project. I mean, the red flags were really up and swinging, but unfortunately, when you have an organization that's trying to raise quite literally $100 million, the public wasn't made aware of these red flags.
Can you elaborate more on the finances and the dollar figures? How much was lost?
This organization, before it closed at the end of 2023, raised about $22 million. They were making just enough year by year, we've uncovered, to float on by. They had operational costs escalate from about $700,000 a year to millions toward the end. And so when you're dealing with that, when you have an organization that's raising money, but it's all going toward operations, there wasn't enough money being saved for this grand project that they took on.
I'm wondering if anyone involved in the OnePULSE Foundation or the owner of the nightclub offered any explanation for what you uncovered.
They have, and to a certain extent. In my reporting, there were people who told me, and my question was why did this cost escalation? Why was that not made public sooner? And they responded, well, we didn't want to spend that much. So you see them, in the years, and this is at the same time, like during the pandemic, but you see them really trying to scale back. But because of the pandemic and construction costs, this $100 million project wasn't descaled in the way that was achievable for them.
We know that this shooting happened and just wrecked this community in June of 2016. I'm talking to you in March of 2024, and still there is no museum, there is no memorial, and OnePULSE has dissolved. Where does that leave things in terms of memorializing victims?
When something this large and to a certain extent painful happens, people want answers. And unfortunately, we don't have all of them, that being one of them. This is now in the hands of the city of Orlando, and it's up to them to take helm of this project. But what I do know from survivors and family members of victims is that they really want an open process, and they want a place where they can grieve their loved ones, a place, that's dignified, better than what's there currently, which was an interim memorial opened in 2018 that, it wasn't meant to be there this long. It's been years. It's, 7 years going on 8. And not a single brick has been laid toward a memorial for these folks. Going into this, I really tried to answer the question, what happened here? And a lot of the public's eye was on this organization at the very beginning because it was such an impactful event for the entire Central Florida community, for the LGBT community, for, worldwide. This was such a horrific event. And then we see the public flame out of this organization in 2023, and it's painful and sad to watch. I hope that, through my reporting, people can get a better understanding of what was going on behind the covers, throughout that time in the middle, and hopefully answer a lot of unanswered questions that people, are asking themselves. And it's, why did this happen?
That was Amanda Rabines sharing insights from her reporting on the collapse of the OnePULSE Foundation. Ahead here on Engaged, we'll look at the impact of Alzheimer's in Black and Latino communities. And later, we commemorate Pi Day with the world's most celebrated irrational number. I'm Sharon Stone. You are listening to Engaged. Don't forget, we want to hear from you. Send us a talkback on our free app or email us at engaged@wmfe.org. You're listening to Engage on WMFE 90.7. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, we'll take a look at Alzheimer's in Black and Latino communities and how Floridians cope with this diagnosis.
You build your life throughout your 20s and your 30s. Usually your 40s is when you're executing all the plans that you have so that in your 50s, 60s, and 70s, you have the life that you always dreamed of. So that's been taken away from us.
We'll talk with a couple confronting early onset of Alzheimer's. Right now, though, the most recent legislative session opened with a number of proposed bills that some activists argued would weaken the rights and inclusion of Florida's LGBTQ plus population. One Senate bill would have made accusing someone of being homophobic or transphobic illegal, carrying a fine of up to $35,000. Another would have protected some businesses that prevent employees from using preferred pronouns. Another would ban pride flags on public buildings. Of the 22 bills slated, one passed. Yesterday, the Parental Rights and Education Act, that's a 2022 law signed by Governor DeSantis that critics call the Don't Say Gay law, was changed by the settlement of a legal challenge to it. Many teachers had actually stopped any mention of LGBTQ topics, fearing lawsuits or losing their jobs. This settlement clarifies the law impacts classroom instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation to students. Guillermo Smith is a senior policy advisor with Equality Florida. That's an LGBTQ civil rights advocacy nonprofit. He joined us to parse out the significance of the settlement, and he started by explaining why he says the law was threatening to Floridians.
There's a fear because of the punitive nature of the law that, for example, teachers will not only be fired if they violate Don't Say Gay, but they can have their teacher's license revoked. That is part of the punitive nature of this law. For students, most importantly, the Don't Say Gay or Trans law sent a really ugly message that there was something so wrong with being gay or trans that their own state government passed a law to prohibit conversations about them in the classroom. That's just a really ugly and toxic message that does not help LGBT young people who oftentimes are struggling to find acceptance either in their own families or in their communities and in their schools. But now that this settlement agreement has taken place and some of the most dangerous and harmful impacts of this law are being dismantled, we can tell students that they can be gay and be trans, celebrate and talk about who they are in the classroom and be proud as they should, because LGBTQ students belong, they are loved, and they are accepted for who they are.
Any thoughts on what brought attorneys to make these concessions?
Well, really, the DeSantis administration made a number of concessions in this settlement agreement in order to make the Don't Say Gay lawsuit go away. They agreed to establish as the policy of the Department of Education that anti-bullying protections specifically based on sexual orientation and gender identity exist and are allowed to be promoted and established in our public schools. They put in black and white text that gay straight alliances and student clubs are allowed to exist in our schools at a time when some school principals and school districts were trying to shut those down as a result of Don't Say Gay. They have made very clear that their Don't Say Gay law does not apply to library books, which, by the way, is a complete reversal of the DeSantis administration's training and guidance on this issue, where they not only told school districts and media specialists that the Don't Say Gay law applied to library books, they told them to err on the side of caution when determining whether or not to include books with LGBT characters, for example. And that led to some pretty devastating actions. You had districts like Charlotte County Schools that their superintendent sent a directive to all schools in the district to remove all library books that included any mention of the existence of LGBTQ people. Those policies can now be reversed and those actions undone because of this settlement agreement. I want to emphasize that the concessions the State Department of Education made as part of this agreement that secure critical protections for LGBTQ students, not only in anti-bullying policies, but also for gay straight alliances and in how they can talk about their identities in schools. This is something that we would work to secure under a Democratic governor or Democratic administration. That is how meaningful and real these wins are for the LGBTQ community.
Are you at Equality Florida preparing for any kind of pushback to the settlement, or is this a done deal?
The Florida legislature and conservatives who are currently a supermajority have oftentimes responded with backlash, and we can expect that lawmakers will return next session to try to undo some of these gains, which is why we have to remain vigilant in fighting for full freedom and equality now and in the future.
A couple of things that did not happen this session. GOP did not expand what critics call the Don't Say Gay law into the workplace. Pride flags are not banned at government buildings. All of these bills that were related to LGBTQ plus community issues, well, most of them failed. What does Equality Florida consider this a victory?
Well, sure. Nearly every anti-LGBTQ bill introduced this session failed. We were able to claim a number of victories as we successfully defeated or neutralized 21 out of 22 anti-LGBTQ bills. That is a demonstration of the power of collective advocacy. It's thanks to the tireless efforts of grassroots advocates from across Florida who stood united against these attempts to silence our voices and erase our identities. And that certainly made a difference. But it's also a testament to the reality that voters in Florida, both conservative, progressive, and moderate, they have all grown tired of these culture war attacks that have been contrived to whip up a right-wing base that have done absolutely nothing to improve their lives or solve any of Florida's problems.
We're talking to Carlos Guillermo Smith with Equality Florida. Of the 21 bills that you mentioned, are there any that you could tell us that you're happiest to see die?
Sure. There was House Bill 1639, also known as the Trans Erasure Bill. This was a really mean-spirited bill that was intended to deny the legal existence of transgender people by preventing them from being able to obtain accurate driver licenses and IDs. It also inserted anti-LGBTQ mandates into private health insurance policies by requiring that every policy cover the widely debunked practice known as conversion therapy, which is a practice that is basically denounced by the American Medical Association and has been banned in several states. Conservative lawmakers literally tried to require that be covered as part of every person's health insurance plan, which was not only dangerous, but also would have led to increased healthcare costs for everyone, gay, straight, transgender, or cisgender, as a result of their obsession with these attacks on LGBTQ people. I was really happy to see that bill died, but expect that they will try to resurrect it in future legislative sessions.
Carlos Guillermo Smith is with Equality Florida, and while LGBTQ rights advocates are celebrating this settlement, Governor Ron DeSantis is also claiming victory in the ruling. We invited DeSantis to join us. We have not heard back. In a written online statement, the governor's office said the settlement is, quote, a major win against the activists who sought to stop Florida's efforts to keep radical gender and sexual ideology out of the classrooms of public school children in kindergarten through third grade. If you miss part of the show today, you can listen to Engage on demand on our website, wmfe.org. There are disparities in diagnosis of dementia. Research from the Alzheimer's Association shows Hispanic and African Americans are at a higher risk of the disease, but not as likely to be diagnosed as white Americans. Orlando husband and wife Francisco Paco Rios and Sadie Burgos met in Puerto Rico. They moved to Florida to pursue her career as a psychologist. Paco was an attorney before he was forced to retire after being diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at just 46 years old. Paco is 48 now and fully aware of what is happening to him and what lies ahead. He and his wife joined Engage to share their devastating experience, to raise awareness and inspire others to get the help and support they need.
Towards the end of the 2020 year, it's when I started noticing, and he started noticing, some changes. Immediately, I didn't think about anything related to Alzheimer's or anything related to any cognitive issues. And we really thought It was just, I want to say maybe like attention problems or, like a mental health, maybe the pandemic and the spinal cord injury, everything is like finally catching up, But at that time, we were still in a good place. I was back to work and everything was like kind of flowing. Towards the end of 2020, 2021, all of these things are happening, all of these, now I know their symptoms. But back then, even though I'm a psychologist, never saw them. Like,
what kind of changes are you talking about?
Sure. So it was subtle changes that started accumulating. So it was changes in patterns of behavior, eating behaviors, spending behaviors, judgment, memory kind of issues, kind of apathy. Like I saw like a kind of an apathy. Now I know it's apathy. Back then I was certain that he was depressed. Like lots of anxieties kind of coming at you out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere. So I'm a psychologist. I'm like, well, you did have a spinal cord injury. Oh, you did have a rough, 2020. It was very taxing on everybody. So
Sure.
Maybe it's all kind of catching up. Eating habits were also kind of significant. He's a vegan. And so that was a change in the eating habits. And now later, I understand that it was part of a symptom of Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's patients tend to crave a lot of sugars and a lot of carbs. So that led to significant weight gain. And all I'm thinking is, you're depressed. A lot of depressed people want to eat sugars, and depressed people spend more money than normal, because he was always the chief financial officer here. Like I had no idea about our finances, right? Because he was such a good administrator. So when that started kind of changing, I'm like, well, it's okay. We can afford it. It's not too bad. So it was just rationalizing and minimizing and kind of in denial of what was in front of us, right? And then the memory problems, and he will go to appointments and then come back, and he couldn't really explain to me what the doctor said. It was just like a one sentence. And I'm like, well, you were there for an hour. Like that could not just be it, right? And then he got lost a few times driving, and he had been telling me, and I'm kind of finding a plausible explanation to whatever was happening. So he flat out told me, I think there's something wrong with my memory. I'm like, no, it's probably your attention and concentration. That's probably, you need to pay attention to what you're doing. You need to concentrate more and all of that. So I never sought help because of that. We sought mental health help, and it wasn't working. They were doing everything. The psychiatrists, psychologists, they were changing medications. Nothing's working. That's another kind of red flag, because it should have responded to the interventions that we were seeking. So we just thought, you just need to pay attention and just relax, whatever. He went to an eye doctor, so the ophthalmologist, something completely unrelated. He had an eye exam. I was in the car because at this point, I'm not driving him, but I'm going to appointments. I said, well, you can go to this one. I'll just stay in the car. He calls me back and he's just like, there's something wrong. Like he needs to have an MRI like right now.
The doctor said this to you.
Okay. And this is towards the end of 2021, like the last week of December. So he's like, we need an MRI to check what's going on in the brain. Like there's an abnormalities. We did the MRI. The MRI came back with atrophy of the brain. So we did another MRI. The MRI this is like all between like 2 weeks. They did a second MRI, same thing. He's like, well, good news is not a brain tumor. Bad news is like his brain is shrinking. So you need to see a neurologist. So they sent us to a neurologist by the second or third week of January of 2022. We sit down, the neurologist is asking me all the questions, and I'm just kind of explaining what I'm telling you. Well, he's been eating a lot and gaining weight, and his, judgment, and, his attention is bad, blah, blah, blah. And then she's like, look at the MRI. You're a clinician. Look at the MRI. And that's when I realized that there was something seriously wrong with, and everything kind of tied together. And that's when he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's.
What is your reaction that you're 46 years old and you have been told you're experiencing early onset of Alzheimer's?
ever since early on in my life, I was or my family has been impacted with Alzheimer's. One of the things that my neurologist had in mind to make the diagnosis was my family history. My dad had Alzheimer's. My grandfather had Alzheimer's. My great grandmother had Alzheimer's. And lots of aunts and uncles from my father's side had Alzheimer's. And ever since I was very young, I started to notice some kind of erratic behavior. He was being violent towards my mom, towards other people, and being combative and belligerent. And my mom told me that he was not like that. He had another personality that I never knew, and that he was being treated for Alzheimer's. So, and that was later in his life. He was 59 when he was diagnosed, but he had a lot of symptoms before.
Some of the things that Paco was explaining is it was not openly spoken in his family that his dad had Alzheimer's. So his dad was a physician. So there was also, they wanted to keep this very private. So the agitation that we see in Alzheimer's and dementias, and some of these aggressive behaviors that we see the patients engage because they're lost or they're confused. So he was seeing that, but he didn't know that it was due to an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So Paco is the youngest of his siblings by a lot. And his dad and his mom were older when they had him. So as he was growing up and he was a teenager, his dad was diagnosed, which happens a lot with early onset dementias. Most of the patients diagnosed with early onset dementia have children below the age 18 at home. And that's what happened in his case. He was growing up seeing this, but not necessarily understanding until he was of age to understand that his dad was sick.
Sadie, do you feel your role has changed from wife to caretaker?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that our relationship now is not going to be the same, or it's not going to look the same, maybe in a year from now or 2-3 years. But yes, isn't what we call like anticipatory grief, right? So you're grieving the process and you're grieving the relationship and you're grieving the future that you thought you were going to have together. And you know that that's no longer going to happen because we're in our 40s. So you build your life throughout your 20s and your 30s. Usually your 40s is when you're executing all the plans that you have so that in your 50s, 60s, and 70s, you have the life that you always dreamed of. So that's been taken away from us. And with that, it's also the relationship. So yes, there's a shift in the relationship and there's a grieving process that's intense. The priorities of the relationship are different. And it's not necessarily romantic in that way, even though we do try our best to keep things as normal as possible. But the symptoms are there and the symptoms interfere with a typical, marriage and relationship. We're still humans, we're still suffering. We still have joy and we have amazing days and amazing weeks and we travel. We still, we want to continue to accomplish things together, being very aware of our reality. So it's a balance. You're constantly having a really nice twirl and then, you might fall down and then you pick up yourself again and you just navigate life in spite of the Alzheimer's.
Do you feel like sharing your story can help these marginalized groups?
That is the main reason that we decided to, number one, me becoming and him himself becoming an advocate, and speaking out and sharing our story for that exact same reason. In the Hispanic community, we shy away from conversations about dementia. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of fears, misinformation, lack of knowledge. There's a lot of barriers with healthcare system and government system and agencies. I'm very well aware of that. I am a clinician, and I think we're in a very unique position because I am a clinician, but I'm also a care partner, and I'm also a wife to someone who is battling Alzheimer's. Being Hispanic as well, to me, it was a no-brainer. I said, we have to, because we have been there. We know how it feels and how, I want to use this word very lightly, imprisoned you feel when you don't share your story, when you don't share your truth. So for us, we have seen it in our families, how do not talk about this, don't let anybody know that you have Alzheimer's, try to play it off, and then you withdraw yourself, and then you end up in isolation, and that is even worse. That's a worse outcome. So it was very important to us. And when he said, let's go out and let's tell everybody what's happening and do the best that we can, I said, of course, we have a voice, we have an experience, and we have the clinical kind of background to be able to talk about this and serve as a resource for this community. That it is, number one, okay to talk not only about Alzheimer's, but mental health, because the both are tied together, because your mental health will suffer, because this is it's a devastating, we do have amazing moments, but this is a devastating experience.
Paco Rios and Sadie Burgos are married and have been together more than 20 years. Paco was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's in 2022. Stephanie Wardlow is a senior program manager with the Alzheimer's Association in Florida. The organization has a program to research health disparities and address diversity and inclusion in dementias.
We do have new medication, first of its kind, that's actually treating the biology of the disease. And when you look at that data, it shows that a lot of the people that were in the research study were of the white population. There were other types of groups, but mainly white. And then the question is, why is that? Well, it wasn't that the researchers weren't reaching out to other communities. They just didn't always qualify. So you might have like a Black American that came in to do the research and they were showing signs of Alzheimer's disease, but the type of test that they had to pass, if you will, to be able to determine if they could get into that research study, they didn't pass it. So there is some question that perhaps Black Americans are, and it's the biology of the disease. Perhaps the biology of the disease is different in different types of people. We know that beta amyloid in the brain isn't the same for everybody. So the APOE4 gene, for example, that puts you at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease is actually stronger in the European white population, not in the Black American population. So there is evidence that is suggesting that the disease actually looks different based on your ethnicity. And I think we are going to have more information about this topic in the near future. There's some researchers actually at the University of Miami that are looking specifically into genes and what those genes look like and how they express themselves in different populations.
Do you think that there is enough attention being put on this disparity in diagnosis based on different races?
There's a lot of talk, and the National Institute of Health has actually put in some policies for researchers that they have to have a certain percentage of different populations, because we don't want to have a cure and it just be for one group. We want to have a cure for all people. We want treatments and technologies to work for everybody. So there is noise in this area for sure.
What kind of health disparities are on your radar in Florida? What do you see?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is just in Florida, but we know that Black patients are 35% less likely to be diagnosed. So, I mean, there's probably individuals out there in Florida that actually have Alzheimer's disease, but they don't even know they have it because they're not going to get a diagnosis. Hispanics and Latinos may be more likely to be diagnosed, but in the later stages of the disease, when individuals are more cognitively and physically impaired. And, that is quite concerning because the new medication, the Leqembi, for example, is new. It works in the early stages of the disease.
Is there evidence that African Americans and the Latino population are at a higher risk of Alzheimer's?
Absolutely. Increased incidence of minority populations. We're talking 1.5 to 2 times more likely in the Black and Latino patients. So the difference in risk for Alzheimer's and other dementias among racial and ethnic groups is most likely explained by disparities produced by the historic and continued marginalization of Black and Hispanic people in the United States.
Well, I guess we talked about just what the path forward is then. Awareness seems like it would be key in this.
Yes, awareness. I mean, everybody, regardless of your background, needs to be involved in research. And the cure is going to come from research. That's where it's going to happen. So anybody in research too, they're getting, really good quality care because they're seeing doctors more often. They're probably going to have access to better scans. They're going to have access to the newest and the best. So I would just encourage anybody, even people that aren't experiencing memory problems, because there's research for people that are fine, to go to Trial Match. Trial Match is a way that you can actually search for different types of studies in your area. There are some also that are online, so you can do studies online. I just think everybody, regardless of who you are, should get involved for sure.
I'm curious what it's like for you dealing with families who are dealing with this diagnosis.
It's sad. I mean, it's sad, but also individuals that are living, not all of them, but a lot of them that are living the experience live every day like it's their last, which is kind of a wonderful thing. There's so much joy at times. There's also sadness. There's a lot of anticipatory grief with people. And there's caregiving, caregivers, there's, caregiver stress. So there's a lot of complications. It's not always a one-way street for everybody. And I do suggest for families that are impacted by the disease to, find a support group. And if they're not comfortable with support groups, to find a person that they can speak with. If they can't find somebody that they trust, they can always call our 1-800 number. They can call anytime. We do have translators, so if somebody needs to speak in Spanish, we would be able to accommodate that. But they can ask questions, just to try to normalize the disease, I think is really important so they can know what to expect. Getting a diagnosis can really help too, because, I could be having all these symptoms and not know why, but if you can get the why and understand, you can plan for the future.
Do people feel maybe a sense of shame around a diagnosis?
Well, I know in the Hispanic culture that at times, especially because they're not getting diagnosed until they're in the later stages, that they might try to normalize what's going on. They might try to hide it. Maybe and I'm not sure why they're not reaching out. I don't know what the answer is to that. I just don't want anybody to feel like they can't. We're very aware of our hearts and that we should take care of our hearts. And I just really want people to know to take care of their brain, because there's things that we can do today to lower our risk, all populations.
Stephanie Wardlow is a senior program manager and research champion for the Alzheimer's Association in Florida. Coming up, it's Pi Day. We're talking circumference, radius, diameter, and all things circles with a Bethune Cookman mathematician. I'm Sharon Stone. You're listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. Just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about or what you're glad you heard. Send us an email at engage@wmfe.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free WMFE app. You were listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. If you miss any part of the show today, you can always listen to Engage as a podcast and just listen when it's convenient for you. Well, today is March 14th, 3/14th. Known as mathletes and fans of deals on pies or pizza, today is known as Pi Day. Pi being the key to calculating circumference and areas and volumes and all kinds of measurements involving circles. For most of us, it was our introduction to irrational numbers, those never-ending numbers that create a very rational anxiety in the mathematically challenged, guilty. But the number carries a certain mystery, doesn't it? There's something intriguing about a number that has haunted both sixth grade students and seasoned engineers. Allen Pelley is an associate professor of mathematics at Bethune Cookman University. He joined us to share the secrets of pi.
Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. In other words, how many times across the circle you'd have to do to go the same distance around the circle.
Why is that important in the world?
That's important because a lot of things are based on circles. A lot of our computations use pi in them. And also it's important because if the world is flat, if the universe is flat, then pi, that ratio, is the same no matter what size the circle is. If the universe is not flat, like think on a basketball, then pi, in order to go across the circle, you have to go up and over the ball.
Okay.
So as the circle gets bigger and bigger, that up and over gets more pronounced, and the ratio is no longer constant. Our universe seems to have pi as a constant, except for where Einstein's gravity kind of warps space.
Can you talk to where would we be without this calculation, just maybe in terms of engineering or mathematically?
We wouldn't be able to do very much because a lot of our calculations are based on some of the trig functions, sine, cosine, and those use pi. A lot of our calculations are based on revolutions, rotating around, and those use pi. Anytime that you have anything that is roughly circular, pi is probably going to show up.
Why doesn't it repeat?
Pi is what's called a transcendental number, and that's a special type of irrational number. A lot of people know about irrational numbers. They never repeat, never terminate. Transcendental numbers are even more than that. They sit above that. And pi is one of the few transcendental numbers that we actually use, even though there's infinitely more transcendentals than the other type of numbers.
Dr. Pelley, help me understand this. Why is there this quest to calculate pi to the most decimals? I was even reading that some people hold competitions to see how many they can remember on Pi Day.
Part of that is because those computations use computers, and as you want to compute more decimal places, you are driven to develop better computers, better working computers. So the quest to compute pi can actually help with predicting weather, DNA sequencing, COVID modeling, because those computers, some of the improvements come out of optimizing pi. Some of the improvements come out of being able to compute a lot of digits of pi. The other is that pi is one of those transcendentals, so it never repeats, it never stops, but there might be patterns in it.
Do you happen to celebrate Pi Day as a mathematician?
Sometimes I do, yes.
What do you do?
Eat some pie.
And what is your favorite?
I should probably say pumpkin pie, about the joke, what do you get when you divide the distance around a jack-o'-lantern by the distance through a jack-o'-lantern?
Pumpkin pie.
Pumpkin pie.
Okay. That's a pretty bad dad joke, but thank you.
Yes, if you ever hear a good pun, please let me know. I have not yet heard a good pun. I like puns, but pi has been known about for at least almost 4,000 years. The ancient Babylonians had an approximation for pi, but they didn't have a very good one. The ancient Egyptians, on a papyrus that we have from 1650 BC, use an approximation for pi. The first actual calculations of pi can be dated back to Archimedes of Syracuse at about 287 to 212 BC, so more than 2,000 years ago. And he used a 96-sided gon, 96-sided shape inside and outside of the circle. And then about 700 years later, Zhu Chongzi did the same type of calculations with a 24,576 cited figure to find an approximation of pi.
That's a daunting task.
Yes, I believe it would be a daunting task. All of the calculations were done by hand. This was 500 AD.
And here we are today, still perfecting it.
Yes, still perfecting it, still finding new ways to calculate pi. About 3 years ago, the record was broken. We now have 62 trillion digits of pi. If you spoke one digit every second, that would take almost 2 million years. And that used an algorithm that was discovered in 1988.
Dr. Allen Pelley is an associate math professor at Bethune Cookman University in Daytona. BCU's oldest alumna is celebrating a birthday today. Miss Magnolia Jackson was born March 14th, 1918. She was an educator for more than 40 years and graduated from Bethune Cookman in 1944. She and some of her family stopped by her studio on their way from Gainesville to Orlando earlier this week.
My name is Evie Edwards. I am the great niece of the birthday girl, Miss Magnolia B. Jackson, who is slated to turn 106 years old on Thursday.
160?
106.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So every year, since her 100th birthday, we look to do something extravagant and different for her birthday.
And this year, they are in Central Florida to visit the Magic Kingdom and Epcot at Walt Disney World.
She's never been to Disney World, so this will be her first visit and hopefully one that she will remember.
6th birthday to Miss Magnolia Jackson. That is all for today's edition of Engage. We'll be back Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. You can learn more about today's program by visiting our website, wmfe.org. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up after NPR News. Quick reminder for you, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen at your convenience. And we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about, what you're glad you heard, anything. Email us at engage@wmfe.org or send us a talkback on the free WMFE app. In the menu, you just select Send a Talkback, record your question or feedback, hit send, and we will get it. And don't forget, you've always got good old voicemail. Call 407-273-2300, extension 246, and leave us one. Thank you for listening to Engage here on 90.7 WMFE.